So, good afternoon. My name again is Oliver Kartus. I work in Woodshole at the Woodshole Research Center, and I'm part of the Mexico Red Alliance. And together with CONAFOR and also CONABIO, we've produced in the last years first high-resolution biomass map for Mexico, derived with the help of the National Forest Inventory System that we've talked about today, and spaceborne radar and optical remote sensing data. Okay, so at first I want to give a little bit of an overview which options there are to produce biomass maps over large areas. When you look into the literature, and in particular the remote sensing literature, there are now many different propositions and different types of data that can be used in theory for biomass mapping. But when you look at large-scale mapping, as for a large country as Mexico, the number of data sets and methods that are available reduce actually quite a bit. So I'm going to talk a bit about the options there are for large-scale mapping, and also about data availability and limitations of the respective data sets. And then I'm going to present how the map for Mexico was actually produced and validated so far. And in the next talk, my colleague Alessandro Bacchini will then talk about the uncertainty of the biomass estimates in the map, which pretty much determines what it can be used for what it is used for. Okay. So how can we create biomass maps? In case of Mexico, we have an intensive forest inventory network. So the easiest way to do it is basically to extrapolate biomass estimates for the plots with the help of a forest cover or land cover map that can be used for stratification. But here we were interested in, can we go further with existing remote sensing data sets and to produce spatially explicit maps that for each location tell us more specifically what the biomass is, how heterogeneous the forest landscape is, and how biomass changes within that landscape beyond the mere strata of forest cover type or ecoregions. Okay. In the last couple of years, LiDAR data has become very popular to use for mapping forest structural attributes, and in particular biomass. And in particular, airborne laser scanners have been used a lot. Airborne laser scanners, as already said, usually the sensors are mounted on airplane and send out LiDAR signals and measure the time the signal needs from the sensor to the forest and then back. And that gives a three-dimensional impression of the forest. These returns, you see here, these points, reflect the vertical and horizontal distribution of the tree constituents, the leaves and the branches. And that's a very powerful tool for estimating forest biophysical parameters such as biomass. The limitation of it is, since it's airborne, it's mostly, what we can get from it are usually transects, a couple of 100 meters wide and tens of kilometers long, potentially, that give us very detailed information about the forest landscape. But at large scale, like a country as Mexico, this data is way too expensive to fly or to acquire across a whole country. There are some countries in Europe, small countries, that have done it, but like Denmark, but at the scale of Mexico, this is currently not an option. Okay. Nevertheless, in the Mexico Red project, we are acquiring LiDAR transects, these yellow lines, in 6 what we call early action areas in 6 states, in Chihuahua, in Jalisco, that is Michoacan, 3 areas in Oaxaca, in Chiapas, and on the Yucatan. So there will be very detailed forest structural information within these transects that can help us to better understand processes like forest degradation, how that impacts the forest structure and in particular the carbon stocks. From space so far, LiDAR has been available from the so-called ICESat GLASS mission, which is a full waveform LiDAR, and it measured the vertical distribution of the energy reflected LiDAR signal back to the sensor, which also gives us very good information about the vertical structure of the forest, but it did it within, 25 is actually wrong, within circa 65-meter large footprints. So it's more like also a sampling tool that can be used to expand forest inventories to get additional information, additional samples. Okay. When it comes to actual mapping, we look at image data sets, so satellite data sets that really are basically pixels that give us information for every point on the ground with different resolutions. Here with tens of meters to hundreds of meters. And the data set that has been used quite a lot so far for biomass mapping at large scale is from MODIS, a multispectral sensor mounted on 2 satellites. And that gives us very detailed information about, well, that gives us information at circa 500-meter spatial scale, 500-meter pixels, about forest structural aspects, leaf phenology, biophysical processes, and that can actually be correlated to biomass. The advantage at this scale is that we get quite a few acquisitions per year. The sensor covers the entire globe within a few days, and even in areas where we have frequent cloud cover, such in Mexico and Yucatan, we have usually enough data to produce radiometrically consistent data sets that are also, when it comes to the time frame of the acquisition, quite narrow. So it's really possible to use data just from one season within a single year, which is not possible when going to high resolution data sets. So also at Woodshole, where my colleague Ali, the first pantropical biomass map has been produced using this modest data set at 500-meter resolution. Since it was pantropical, the map was cut off at about in the center of Mexico. When we go to higher resolution, a very important data set is of course Landsat. The data is freely available since I think 2008 and has been recently used to map the biomass of Peru in this case. It is a bit more challenging to use Landsat because it is higher resolution, there is less data per year, and it's more of an effort to produce radiometrically consistent data sets for large areas that also reflect a relatively narrow time frame. Often we need to integrate data from several years to get really cloud-free observations for every area. That's a major constraint. And in the case of Peru, similar actually for the pantropical map, LiDAR was used to kind of overcome the limitations of limited field inventory data availability. Typically, we have to calibrate models that relate whatever the sensor measures to the biomass on the ground. And for that, we need quite a large sample of field measurements. In Peru, for instance, in contrast to Mexico, this is not available. So they use airborne laser scanners in a 2-stage upsampling approach. So few field measurements to calibrate models that relate the LiDAR measurements to biomass, and then the LiDAR can help to calibrate models that then relate the Landsat data, and also some additional information on the elevation, on the general geography of the area to biomass. And that's how they produced the biomass map for Peru. So far we've mostly talked about optical remote sensing. For about 25 years we've also had so-called radar sensors in space, mostly from the European Space Agency and also from the Japanese Space Agency. Radars are active sensors that send out microwaves that are signals with a length of a couple of centimeters to decimeters, send that out to the surface and measure what is reflected back. And that gives us also information about forest, because the signal penetrates somewhat into forest. We can go to the next slide. So dependent on the actual wavelength the signal has, we see different components of a forest. When we have a short wavelength of 3 centimeters, which we call X-band, we mostly see the needles and the leaves. The longer the wavelength, the more we see the large components of the trees. So in case of L-band, which is the longest wavelength we have available from space, everything longer would only be available from airplanes. We see the larger branches, to some degree the stem. In a couple of years, ESA has announced that they will launch a so-called P-band sensor, which will be called biomass because that's its main purpose. And in a couple of years, we hopefully get this sensor, and because of the long wavelength, it will give us a signal that very much reflects the stem volume, where most of the biomass actually is located. So this will be a very good data set. But so far, the longest wavelength we have available from space, from a Japanese sensor, actually is L-band. So that's, you can keep in mind, it's a bit of a simplification, but that's basically what we see in radar images, what they reflect. From the European Space Agency, we had so-called C-band data, which is shorter, which is 5 centimeters. And the agreement so far has been in the science community that it's not very useful for mapping forest structure and biomass, because it's the 5 centimeter signal is mostly reflected at the top of the canopy, and it doesn't see much. A bit of an exception is in the boreal, in the long frozen winters, when the trees are frozen, the signal penetrates much deeper into the canopy and actually sees quite a bit of the 3-dimensional structure. And that allowed some first applications, the first stem volume map, in this case, of the boreal and adjacent temperate zones. For this, we need a lot of data, multi-temporal data, which so far has only been available at coarse resolution, so this is a 1 kilometer product across the pantropical. Similar data is not available at higher resolution for such large areas. So, coming to L-band, as I've said, the longest wavelength we have so far, we had it in the 90s from a Japanese mission called JERS. And between 2006 and 2011, there was a Japanese mission called ALOS Pulsar. The unique thing was so far that they really had a global acquisition strategy and acquired at least once per year a global coverage at circa 15-meter resolution. So at least once per year we had global coverage with this data, which allowed basically for the first time radar applications at large scale, at country scale, for instance. And some first tests we did in the northeastern US was a biomass retrieval, and we saw quite nice results when we also had here some multi-temporal data, and we saw sensitivity up to about 180 tons per hectare, which is actually quite good. Of course, not sufficient to detect the highest biomasses in tropics, but in the temperate zone where biomass hardly exceeds this level, this type of data is actually a valuable information source. We can skip the next 2 slides. So, we've seen we have optical data, which to some degree is available, correlated to biomass, and we have radar data that is correlated to biomass, but they both don't measure biomass. We correlate just different aspects that they see of the forest to biomass, but both have their limitations. So an interesting approach is therefore to use them both together. Where in mining, we have mining algorithms available that allow us to use a wide range of spatial information to kind of isolate the complementary information in both data sets to get to better products. And this was done also at the Woodshole Research Center, a first high-resolution biomass map of the US. It's a 30-meter product produced from Landsat and also from radar data sets. And that was kind of the starting point of our work in the US. The exact same data sets that were used for the US are not available in Mexico, but Landsat, of course, is. The radar part here was SOTM, which we couldn't use in Mexico, but that's why we went to ALOS PALSA, the L-band mission. Okay, so now I'm going to talk specifically about the map that was produced for Mexico. Okay. So, as I've said, what is available freely, and cost is certainly a factor, is the Landsat the Landsat archive, which has ample of data for Mexico, and we have a couple of radar satellites available for the circa 2000 or mid 2005 time frame. But the longest wavelength we have from space is L-band, and we had free access to that data through a NASA agreement with JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency. So for Mexico, this seemed to be the ideal so far data combination Landsat, and which allows us to produce maps at high spatial resolution, 30 meter. And another aspect is, of course, there was no cost associated with the data, and these types of the L-band and Landsat type of data will be available for at least another 10 years, maybe longer. So there's data continuity is warranted, so that similar data can be used for future mapping purposes. So this is the initial ALOS PALSA mosaic that we used for Mexico. What we can see in the mosaic are these striping effects. So these are actually orbits. So one acquisition when the sensor flew along actually from south to north. And the thing with radar is it's not only sensitive to forest structure, but also to moisture quite a bit. So when we see these brighter stripes here, it was simply more wet. And that is a bit of a problem when using this data for mapping purposes, because you would see these stripes in any kind of product. So we did do some normalization where we tried to harmonize the statistics of these outlying orbits to neighbor orbits. Here you also see these striping effects quite clearly in the Yucatan. This was actually an image that was acquired in 2007, about a week after the hurricane had passed through the area and was much more wet than the neighbor image that had been acquired a couple of weeks before. So we did some normalization, and were able to produce a mostly harmonized, radiometrically consistent mosaic for Mexico. So that is basically input number one for the biomass map. We also did some segmentation to identify what should be homogeneous forest areas to further reduce the noise. Radar images are quite noisy, which is called speckle, and by averaging within certain areas we can reduce that noise. But we can also, that allowed us also to calculate some texture metrics within what is supposed to be a forest stand, and texture metrics have also been shown to add some information in the biomass retrieval. Okay. Next, so this is actually a Landsat product. It's a canopy density product produced by Matt Hansen. I think from using Landsat data acquired in 2001 to 2004. The time frame actually already demonstrate what the challenges is using Landsat. We don't have as much data as at coarser resolution MODIS, and in particular in areas with frequent cloud cover, we have to look into data acquisitions, data that has been acquired potentially in several years to get to cloud-free, consistent mosaics. And that was done here, and similar to the global MODIS VCF product, the canopy density map was produced. And that was our Landsat input to the biomass retrieval. Canopy density is, of course, quite obviously a predictor for the biomass density, at least the horizontal. It kind of reflects the horizontal discontinuity of the forest. Less, of course, though, for the vertical. So, how was the map produced? We had from Corner 4 access to the INFIS database, And for each plot, the biomass information, and we've heard this morning how this biomass estimation, actually the carbon density in tons carbon per hectare, was generated or estimated from the field measurements. We extracted the different remote sensing data sets for each plot to link the INFIS database with our remote sensing data sets to be able to calibrate models that we could then use to predict the biomass for the whole country. So we had the pulsar data sets, we had the Landsat product, we also used from a DEM, the global SRTM, DEM information like elevation and slope. In particular, elevation we know has quite some predictive power in Mexico because typically we have the highest biomasses at the higher elevations. And although we didn't directly use a remote sensing product, we used the forest type information from INFIS at this point for the modeling because we wanted to see does it make sense to integrate forest type information into the prediction. If that is the case, we could of course use land cover or land use products like the INEFI series, which however is coarse scale 1 to 250,000, or the newer or the recently released MadMax products, for instance. Okay, so here are the modeling results. What we did is we took, first of all, we knew we have some problems over topography. There are some topographic effects, so for the modeling itself, we didn't consider INFIS plots that were located on steep slopes steeper than 15 degrees. So we threw that out of the model development database. And the remaining plots we divided into a calibration data set and a training data set. About 80% of plots we used for calibration and 20% for an independent validation. And here we see the model predictions for the 20% independent plots. And we see we could explain about 50% of the biomass variability at the plot level, at the 1 hectare level. And we saw a relatively good agreement along the 1-to-1 line up to about 50 tons carbon per hectare, beyond which we saw, at least in parts of the country, some trend towards underestimation. But below 50 tons per hectare, the agreement is quite good. And okay, we're also interested, so what I've shown on the last slide was a national prediction model, just one prediction model for the entire country. But we're also interested in if a more stratified approach, so modeling per ecoregion, can help to improve the results. So we tested a modeling and prediction separately for about 30 different ecoregions from the WWF global ecoregional map to see if that can actually help. But what we found was, the results were nearly identical. So the stratification in this sense, in terms of ecoregions, didn't help the prediction performance at all throughout the country. So that's why we stick to the national prediction model. Okay. We are also interested in the retrieval results for different forest types. And how the different predictors that we use contributed to the retrievals. So what we see here are the R-square, RMSE, and prediction bias for 6 groups or coarse groups of forest types, so coniferous broadleaf, tropical humid, tropical dry, and mangroves. And the case 1 in each of these boxes represents the retrieval with all predictors, all data sets we had available. Case 2 was the case when we excluded the forest type information, which came from INFIS in this case actually. And then these cases show the results when excluding either the optical or the radar or the DEM data sets. What we see is, first of all, for each forest type using all predictors, we explain about 50% of the biomass variability. Major exception is mangroves. For mangroves, the national prediction model didn't work very well. What we also see is that between cases 1 and 2, there's hardly a difference. So the forest type information hardly contributed to the biomass retrieval, which is why in the end we didn't use it to map. So we didn't use existing land use maps to produce the biomass map. Also an important result is regardless of the types of predictors we used, the bias, so the difference, so on average the predicted biomass was very close to the average biomass within the forest type that came from INFIS. So we were all, within the forest types, the predictions were unbiased at national scale. So in different biomass intervals, we see actually quite different retrieval accuracy. We see that the retrieval error, so only focus on case 1, which is the predictor combination we in the end used. The retrieval error was actually the highest in case of very sparse forest with low canopy density, because basically when we have sparse forest, the structural diversity is much larger than for the dense forest canopy, for which we could predict the biomass much more accurately. So that's the biomass map that was produced for the entire country with the national prediction model. And we see a distribution that should make sense. Highest biomasses on the Yucatan and the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt and Oaxaca, mostly at high elevations here. Okay. So we estimated the total biomass we get from the map, and initially we had an estimate of 2.2 petagram, which is significantly higher than what Conifer estimates based on INFIS and INEGI datasets for stratification. The thing is, in the map, you can just click back. Initially, we estimated the biomass for each pixel in the datasets, where the canopy density datasets from Landsat set told us a non-zero canopy density, but non-zero, that doesn't mean forest. So a forest with 10% canopy density is still not, but that's not a forest. It's very sparse vegetation, woody vegetation. So when excluding these sparse vegetation types, just go ahead. These sparse vegetation types, we actually ended up with a total carbon stock for Mexico that is much closer to the current estimates, or actually very close to the current estimates from INFIS in the latest INEGI Series 5 map. So we have seen so far the estimates were unbiased at national scale. They were unbiased per forest type, but the forest types, of course, these coarse groups of forest types like mixed coniferous broadleaf you can find all over the country, so that didn't guarantee that we don't have regional biases in the map. So what we did is we used a so-called hexagon grid that is actually used by the US Forest Service for their development of the forest inventory system. Each hexagon is about 650 square kilometers large, and within each hexagon we estimated the average biomass from the map and from INFIS. And here you see that for almost the entire country we hardly have any regional bias in the estimates, and the agreement is actually quite nice at the hexagon scale. The only exception a bit is the dense forest in Quintana Roo, where we see significant underestimation. So the tropical humid forests on Quintana Roo, we have some underestimation. Okay. So the next we went the scale larger, and we're interested in how well does the map agree at the state scale with the INFIS statistics. And we see when we compare the averages, so these are the averages, average biomasses or carbon densities per state derived from INFIS and INEGI, the INEGI series for plot stratification, and the average biomass in the map, and we see a very nice agreement. The largest difference, again, this is Quintana Roo, where we see some underestimation compared to INFIS. And the same is true, we find the same nice agreement when we don't look at the average, but at the total carbon stocks. And here you see a comparison for each state, how well map and the INFIS statistics agree. So in conclusion, we were able to produce a map from high-resolution data sets using widely available, globally available Landsat and radar data sets that are not only available for the past, but also will be in the coming years. And we have seen that at the plot scale, the hectare scale, the uncertainties are very large. So that kind of limits the use of the map at the finest scale that it actually provides. So it is delivered as a 30-meter product, but at that scale, we have to be careful with the biomass estimates, how we use them. But at the regional scale, when we start to aggregate the estimates, average, go into ejidos, into municipalities, or even larger, then we see that we seem to get unbiased and actually quite good estimates. The question that there is now, we haven't talked specifically, or in the next talk my colleague is going to talk about the uncertainties of the biomass estimates at these different scales. And the question is there a use of the map in the Mexican MRV system? We have seen at the state scale, the estimates are basically identical. But as Osvaldo has shown, in cases for smaller states, for municipalities where the sampling is very sparse, where there are only few plots, the question is there a role for the biomass map, which gives us information for every point in the country? Is there a role for the biomass maps in the MRV at scales finer than the state? Okay? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Alessandro Baccini. I also work at the Woodshole Research Center. I'm part of the MREP team, and I've been working with Oliver and the team at the center that developed the map that just Oliver showed. My job was try to come up with an estimate of the uncertainty on the map. So we have this beautiful map, very nice, colorful, beautiful picture, but what can we do with that? And so what I'm going to show today is sort of the process that we use to come up with some estimate of uncertainty in the map and at different scale. The methodology was based on the pantropical work that was done a few years ago and was refined for the Mexico case. But before we do that, I just wanted to go over again sort of the basic approaches that we have to come up with estimate of biomass over large area. So if you're a country and your goal is to know what is the biomass in your country, you want to know the average biomass of the country and the total biomass of your country, and you do have a national forest inventory, you're done. You're in great shape. You can use the National Forest Inventory result. That is going to give you a very good estimate of what the total biomass is in the country. Okay? But it's one number. So you have the problem that you have a number for the country, but you don't really know the spatial distribution inside the country. Okay? So there are limitations in the application. Okay? Well, this is an easy case, and indeed people try to solve that, and to solve that, what it has been done, as Mexico is doing, is that they are combining the forest inventory data with maps, with land cover maps. And what you do in this approach here is called stratify and multiply, is that you use your field data to assign an average value to a land cover class, right? So you intersect your field data with the map class, with the thematic map. And so each class will have an average value of biomass. Fine, so now you have a representation of where the biomass is in the country, right? It's a general representation of the distribution. Then there has been sort of an extension of that approach where on top of land cover maps, people using GIS try to use auxiliary information such as elevation, climate, and population density sometimes, in order to further describe the spatial distribution of the biomass inside at the class. Okay. And then there are ecological models that those are very good sort of and useful to look at projection, to look at the future, how biomass is going to change if the temperature is changing, or how the biomass is going to change if the precipitation is changing. Okay, but they have a large uncertainty if you just want to come up with an estimate of the actual biomass that you have in your study region. And the final approach, and that it is the one that Oliver used and that is in these past few years is the most recognized one, is what is called the direct approach. So I will just spend a few words here to describe what the direct approach is. So first of all, the direct approach doesn't need any averaging of land covers. Okay, in the direct approach, what you do is that you try to find the relationship between the biomass on the ground, so the field data, the biomass that you measure on the ground, and what the satellite is seeing. So I don't know how many of you have experience working with satellite data, but if you look at the satellite image, what it is really, it is a picture. So a digital picture as you have in your phone, right? If you zoom in, you zoom, at some point you see those big squares. You saw the pixel of the image, right? A satellite image has the same structure. It's a series of pixels, of little squares, of cells, okay? And the reason because you see your picture with different colors and you recognize objects in the picture is because each of these cells has a different number, has a different value, okay? The value in those cells is the result of the reflection of the light from the object back to the satellite, okay? So the satellite is really recording the reflected light from the sun to the target. Could be a tree, could be a car, could be a field, okay? Each target on the ground has properties such as the reflected light is different. And so the sensor record this reflected light, and because it is different, assign a different value. So what we do with the direct approach really is to link the biomass data with the value of those pixels of the cell. Okay. This is a basic idea. Now to do this we use models, we use regression analysis, we use more sophisticated algorithms that better extract information from the satellite data. Okay. Now, just going one step back, so what is the problem that we see when we use the stratify and multiply? So what is the problem when we try to do what we are trying to do now, to combine forest inventory data with the land cover map? As Osvaldo said this morning, one is the number of samples. It could happen that in your class, in your land cover class, you have very few samples. And that is going to drive your uncertainty very high. Osvaldo showed in the table that for classes with 30, 40 samples, the uncertainty is above 100%, right? So that is one limitation that you have with this approach. The other problem you have is that at the end of the day, you need to use the area of your class in order to know what the total biomass is. And a thematic map, a land cover map, has errors. Okay? The maps with more than 6 classes tend to have 30% errors. So we are here trying to try to address the error in the emission factor. And we are talking about 10% error, 5%. It's pretty good compared to sometimes line cover maps or line cover change maps or the activity data. And the most important issue that at least I see with this approach is that if you want to use this information to derive your emissions, right, you want to reduce the error in the emissions. You want to have a good estimate of the emissions. So you need to know how much biomass has been lost. Well, if you use the stratified multiply approach, you have a problem, because if we look at one class, for example, the forest on low hill class, okay, and we look at the distribution inside of that class of the biomass, this plot here, this is showing that the biomass inside of that class can go between 60 to 300 tons per hectare. There is a large variability inside of that class. This information is based on a very high resolution airborne LiDAR data. So here is the problem. If the forest that has been lost is here, is the 250, 300 tons, you lose a lot of carbon. If it is here at the 60 tons per hectare, you lose little amount of carbon. So by just using the mean, right, you have a large uncertainty on that emission factor. Okay. So one solution is actually to be able to sort of have the full distribution of the biomass that you have on the forest. And that is what the direct approach is trying to do. Okay, it's trying to better capture the spatial distribution of the biomass on the ground. So now, what are the source of error that we have when we try to generate maps based on the direct approach? Some are the common error that we have. So we have errors in the field data, right? We can make mistakes in the DBH. When we use the tape, someone maybe doesn't take the measurement of the tape horizontally, and the tape all tilted, so the DBH is bigger, or some crew is not really doing a good job in putting down the tape, and so the tape is not straight, is all left and right, here and there, right? And the problem with that is then you can make mistake in considering trees inside of the plot or outside of the plot. And if that happens, usually it's a big error, because if you have a plot of 40 meters by 40 meters, right, and you sign a tree inside of your plot just because the tape is not right, okay, well, that tree, then when you report your estimate to the actor, is going to be counted 6.5 times, because in order to report your estimate from the 40 meters by 40 meters to the hectare, you have to multiply by 6.5. So each error in that plot is going to multiply 6.5 times. Okay, so if it is a big error, if it is a big tree, you will have a big error in your plot. And that is a source of uncertainty. Okay. Then of course we have errors in the allometry. Okay, in the field we don't measure biomass. What we measure is the diameter, is the DBH, and the height sometimes. Okay. Then we have the sampling error. Well, are the samples, number of samples, and the stratification, the design representative of the variability? You know, we always have that sampling error. And then when we try to use the remote sensing, we have to add the model error, because in that phase we don't work anymore with measurements, but we work with estimates, right? We use statistical models and satellite data to generate estimates. They're not measurements anymore. And as a statistical model, we'll have an error. Okay. And then, of course, there is this issue of the registration, that with a direct approach, it's very important to make sure that you try to find the relationship between the ground and what the satellite is seeing. They need to perfectly match. So if your plot, if you go in the field and you record the center of your plot with the GPS, and you are down in a valley, and the senior for the GPS is bad, and you have an error of plus or minus 20 meters, and you work with satellite data at 30 meters, well, it's very possible that what you measure in the field is here, but what the satellite is actually seeing is there. Okay, and so then it becomes very noisy, the relationship. Okay, so briefly, the general approach that we have been using to generate the map is that we take the INFIS data, right, the DBH data, the tree-level DBH, we know the DBH of each tree. We use allometric equation to convert it to biomass. We use this data to find the relationship with the satellite images. We use a statistical model. In this case, is called random forest. Has nothing to do with the forest. Actually, it's an algorithm that is used in finance, is used in healthcare, has many different applications. Okay, so we combine the field data with the remote sensing, and we come up with an estimate. The good thing is that it's wall-to-wall. Okay, in this case, we don't need to be afraid of how many samples we have in the results. It's wall-to-wall for the entire country. So far, so good. But then, okay, so how good is the estimate? Okay, the map is represented by many cells, right? Pixels. In our case, the original pixel size is 30 meters by 30 meters. So we wanted to come up with an estimate of the uncertainty at the pixel level, but also at the aggregated scale. And we wanted to make sure that we will compute the total error, because the error that we have in final maps is the result of many errors in the process. So we wanted to propagate the error from the allometry, the error from the model, right? And so come up with this estimate of the total error for each pixel. To do that, we use a Monte Carlo approach. The basic of that has been explained this morning by Osvaldo. We adapted that to the maps approach, and what we really did is that we introduced noise into the system. We introduced a randomly distribution of errors, okay? And we ran many simulations of that. And we do that in a bootstrap approach with interconnected simulation and sampling. So now, very briefly again, if we are considering the error from the allometry, what we see is that in this plot I'm showing a series of different allometric equations, right? So if you know the DBH of your tree, you can look at your model and you will know what the biomass is. Simple. The error within your allometric equation is not very big. The problem of the error with allometry is that when you select the wrong equation, or when you don't have it, and so that if instead of using the equation that is the black line, you actually use the one that is the green line. In that case, you can see that the error is very big. okay? So it's very important to make sure that you use the right allometric equation. And so then if we look at the tree-level uncertainty, so here in the axis we see the DBH of the trees, and we see that the uncertainty is increasing as a function of the size of the tree. But then when we aggregate the trees at the plot level, so we take the sum of all the trees within the plot, right? And for example, here we just show a random plot. We see that the error actually is not so big. We see that at the 95% confidence interval, the range of the estimate is between 89.5 to 104 tons per hectare. It's not a very big error, okay, at the plot scale. So that's good, because that is what we use in the next step, that is the development of the model. We relate that value with the satellite data. But then what we find is that if we look at the error in the map at the 30 meters pixel, okay, well, we are in trouble. The confidence interval on 95% is between 17.8 to 45. So that means plus or minus 45%. Okay, that is a random pixel. Okay, in the map you just put the finger somewhere and you say, okay, I want to know what the error of that pixel is. That's what we did. We are showing one pixel, and that is the error. Okay, so it's pretty big, and you can expect some places will have even a bigger error, some places will have a smaller error. But then we said, okay, 30 meters is a very high resolution, and we sort of expected that errors could be big. So we aggregated the data to the 1 hectare scale. Okay, so now each pixel is 100 meters by 100 meters. And we see that, again, if we look at the percent error, the distribution of the error, of the percent error, for a 1,000 random pixel in the map is shown in this figure here, and you see that mainly your error in the pixel at 1 hectare at 95% confidence interval, it's about 20 plus or minus 20%. Okay, and this is so for each unit in the map of 100 meters by 100 meters, you can expect that distribution of the uncertainty, plus or minus, the majority of the times 20%. Sometimes less, more often more. No, not actually more often, but sometimes can be much higher. Now we said, okay, but are we really going to use it at a pixel scale? Because our understanding for now is that the approach will report at the administrative level, will report at the state level, at the sub-state level, okay? And so, because we know that the error tends to decrease with the scale, we took a random square of 30 kilometers by 30 kilometers, and we did the same exercise, and then we see that if we aggregate, if we try to assess the uncertainty in an area of 30 kilometers by 30, the error goes down furthermore, and it's plus or minus 5.8%. It's plus or minus 6%. So that is telling us that, depending at which scale you need to report or you need to have the information, you have different level of uncertainty. And 6% is decent. It probably in some places could be a little bit higher, but it is decent. And the nice thing of the map is that you will know the uncertainty I mean, it's a wall-to-wall uncertainty. You know, you will have a representation of where the errors are. But so the question is the map going to be useful at the national scale? Not really. I mean, because you already have the result from the forest inventory data, so if you want to report at the national scale, you know what the biomass in the country is. Okay. Next, at the state level, we saw that the estimates from the map are actually very consistent with the INFIS data at the state level. So again, is it useful? Next. But then if you want to go farther down, right, you start to run into trouble using the INFIS data. And here you can see that in some of these small administrative units, you do have 5, 6 plots. But here in the Northeast, for example, you don't have any plot. Okay? So instead of using a general average, it could make sense to use the biomass map there. But still, I believe that that area is bigger than 30 kilometers. Okay, so you could still use the map and have a decent error there where you don't have any INFIS data. Okay, so you have to consider the alternative would be you go in and you put some field data. Okay, you measure some field data, or you just use the map. Next, and of course, if you want to report by forest type, you can derive estimate of the uncertainty in each land cover class, in each vegetation class, and you can have a distribution, so you have an idea of what the error in the class is, right? Next, but as I was saying, the nice thing is that you will have a map showing you where the errors are. Okay, this is a map of the percent error. Okay, now this is not the map of the error for the Mexico map that was generated at 30 meters. This is based on the MODIS pantropical map. So this is a 500 meters. Okay, but we are generating exactly the same for the 30 meters map. So then you will know where the errors are, and we will generate a table with the estimate of the biomass and the uncertainty for each state, and depending on what we are asked for sub-state level administrative unit. So that then you can decide, you can compare the INFIS uncertainty with the map uncertainty at the state or at sub-state level. Next, and for the pantropical work, for the MODIS work on 500 meters, we were also interested to try to understand which data was the biggest contributor to the uncertainty, which data was introducing the largest error. Okay, so that we could improve that data, or we could just remove the data if we could. And so here we displayed the three data sets that we use for the pantropical work. The error from the allometry is in red, the error from the LiDAR glass is in green, and the error from the MODIS data is in blue. And you can see that it's quite interesting that the majority of the uncertainty is in green. So what the green means is that the majority of the error comes from the glass LiDAR data. And you know the country better than I do, but if you look at the pattern of the green is where most of the topography is. And that is very consistent with the LiDAR data, with the glass data that we use, because glass is a large footprint LiDAR sensor and does very bad in slope when the slope is bigger than 10%. Okay, so that is introducing a large error. Okay. And then it's difficult to see here, but you do have error with the MODIS data here and up there and here and up here, okay? But what it is interesting is that the allometry, the red, doesn't really show up much. Okay? So we could do a similar exercise for the Mexico map, for the new map too. And next, the tutorial. So in summary, I mean, the errors from allometry we don't think that are very important when you use satellite derived maps. The spatial aggregation, we see that reduce the uncertainty. So that is a question. Which level of uncertainty are you willing to accept? Different vegetation type, land cover type will have a different error. Okay, so it's another layer that you could use to stratify. The biomass map, we think that can be actually used in combination with the forest inventory data. You know, where you have few field plots, you can bring in the map that could help. And of course, we are looking to improve the actual map, and we saw in a study in Colombia and in Bolivia where we use an extensive data set of airborne LiDAR data, not glass data, but airborne LiDAR data, that the errors significantly decrease when you combine field data with airborne LiDAR data. And as you saw, there is a large amount of LiDAR data that will be available very soon. Part has been collected by Carto data here in Mexico, and part is available through the NASA program. So there is room for improvement. So still I stop here. I hope I was clear enough. If you have any questions, please.
Secretaría de Medio Ambiente y Recursos Naturales.